Hi, my name is Tom Power and I'm a lecturer in the Department of Indonesian Studies at the University of Sydney, where I have the opportunity and privilege to work closely with the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre. And it's a great pleasure to be able to provide some concluding remarks to the fantastic Politics in Action Forum that they've put together this year, despite the pandemic. So in order to do so, I've identified three key themes that were important in each of the presentations. I think these were sort of commonalities across the presentations that we saw this year. And I'll run through those to start. So the first is the COVID-19 crisis, which is of course having significant ramifications in the region, both politically and economically. And this was one issue that was mentioned in each of the presentations. And we can see some important aspects of the crisis in terms of political dynamics and the ways in which we might think about the relationship between politics and pandemics. A second issue is what I feel would have been the headline theme of this year's conference if it weren't for the pandemic. And that is a broad pattern of illiberal consolidation across Southeast Asia. This applies both in democratic contexts where we see an increased slide towards illiberal democracy, but also in authoritarian contexts where we're seeing a pattern of consolidation of power in the hands of established or incumbent elites. A third issue relates to international challenges, and here particularly I'm referring to the continued story of the expansion of Chinese influence in the region, and also the means or the ability of regional cooperation and regional architecture to face that changing regional political landscape. So we'll start with the COVID-19 pandemic and its impacts on the region. There are three patterns that arose from the presentations that I think are worth just briefly reflecting on. The first of those is the way in which the pandemic has highlighted and reinforced established socioeconomic inequality in the region. And this is something that we've seen really from the wealthier countries such as Singapore to poorer countries that have fairly limited social safety nets. One of the common comments that we might hear made about the COVID pandemic is that it doesn't discriminate between rich and poor. But of course, this is not true. Wealthier people are more able to access healthcare, they're more able to access testing, and importantly, they're more able to self-isolate, they're more able to withdraw from economic activity than poorer people in those societies. So people who are living in precarity, in a position of economic precarity, are clearly especially vulnerable to the fallout from this pandemic. And it's potentially the case that we'll see a shift in economic dynamics across the region where people are falling from being on the brink of poverty actually into destitution. Already we see this sort of pattern emerging in places like Indonesia. A second issue is, at least over the short term, in recent weeks and recent months, we've seen incumbent power holders using the crisis as an opportunity to consolidate their grip on power, or at least to limit avenues for political change. So the first way in which this has happened is through performance legitimacy. This was an issue raised by Huang in her discussion of Vietnamese politics, where we've seen a regime which was suffering the ill effects of a series of corruption scandals in recent years use the crisis as a means of buttressing its performance legitimacy. So the ostensibly effective response of the Vietnamese administration to the pandemic has allowed it to recover some of that lost performance legitimacy. On the other side of the ledger, we see cases such as Hun Sen's expansion of emergency powers in Cambodia, which has allowed for the increased repression of opposition in a country which had already slid into full authoritarianism as a result of a process of executive aggrandizement. Similarly, in the Philippines, as Jean mentioned, we've seen Rodrigo Duterte using this as an opportunity to strengthen this pattern of militarization and securitization of society amid the ongoing pandemic. So this pattern of incumbents manipulating political using the pandemic as an excuse to manipulate political powers and manipulate the political landscape is certainly one that we've seen in recent months and over the short term. But a third issue is how the pandemic will affect political outcomes over the longer term. And here I think the big question is whether the economic fallout from the pandemic actually erodes some of the political legitimacy of regional administrations. If we see economic collapse and we see sort of regional recessions, regional depression, the pandemic could prove to be some sort of black swan event, which actually causes far more dramatic changes to the political and economic systems in the region. And in that case, it would be very interesting to see how speakers at next year's Politics in Action Forum may be reflecting on what's come about as a result of the COVID crisis. One of the other issues that is really relevant to this discussion of how the pandemic is playing out in different political systems is this notion of an authoritarian advantage in dealing with the crisis. So we've seen analyses that suggest that the liberal democracies of the West, of Western Europe and North America, have been disproportionately badly affected by the outbreak, and that more authoritarian countries, places like China and indeed Vietnam, have done a far better job of controlling the spread, at least according to official data. So how does this look in Southeast Asia? In order to examine this phenomenon in the region, I put together this table which lists countries, 10 countries in Southeast Asia, according to their democracy scores using the Varieties of Democracy, Liberal Democracy Index for 2020. So we have the most democratic country according to this index in the region being Timor-Leste, the least democratic being Cambodia. And we can examine how these countries have fared according to a set of widely used criteria that measure the effectiveness of the response to the pandemic. So this includes rates of testing and also case mortality rates. Now, the picture that I think immediately stands out is that in terms of government capacity to provide testing, we don't see any consistent pattern. Timor-Leste and Indonesia have provided low rates of testing, but similarly Laos and Cambodia have also failed in providing extensive testing. So there's no discernible advantage for authoritarian regimes in terms of how effectively they've rolled out testing programs. A second issue, and this is one I think perhaps more of a caveat, is that Singapore is an outlier in this picture. So we, of course, have a performance legitimacy-based regime in Singapore, one which is authoritarian, but which is perhaps less deeply authoritarian, less repressive than many of the other countries in the region. And Singapore, of course, is also far richer than many of its neighbours. So the high rate of testing in a city-state is something of an outlier. Additionally, the very low mortality rate is indicative of the much better healthcare available to Singaporean citizens than citizens of many of the other countries in Southeast Asia. Really, the outlier in Southeast Asia in terms of this sort of authoritarian advantage hypothesis is Vietnam. So Vietnam is a country that's been used fairly widely in international analyses of successful responses to the COVID pandemic. And it was also one of the key themes of Huong's presentation, that the Vietnamese administration seems to have done a good job in preventing the spread of the virus and in limiting its impact upon the health of Vietnamese citizens. However, I think there's an important caveat here, which is that the sources of information for testing and mortality rates in Vietnam are only limited to the government, only limited to the regime. So the Ministry of Health is the source for this data. And at the very least, given that we know that the Vietnamese administration has a strong interest in ensuring it looks good in its response to the pandemic, I think we need to take the Vietnamese data with a grain of salt. So the notion that Vietnam has had no deaths as a result of the pandemic is, I think, it should, I think, be treated with a degree of skepticism. All the more so when we consider that the 3 countries in the region, besides Timor-Leste, which claim to have had no deaths, are all the 3 most authoritarian countries that we see very differing levels, a significant amount of divergence in the levels of testing and also in the capacity of those states to deliver effective healthcare to their citizens. So my tentative suggestion, and I think much more research will be required to investigate this hypothesis more thoroughly in Southeast Asia, but my tentative suggestion is that when we see lower rates of deaths in more authoritarian countries, this may actually reflect the ability of those countries to restrict access to data and to restrict flows of information more so than the ability of those authoritarian systems to actually provide better healthcare outcomes and to more effectively limit the transmission of the disease. Potentially, these are two sides of the same coin. So the restriction of civil liberties and the restriction of media access can prevent transmission, perhaps. But my feeling is that we need to really look at the way in which information can be more easily manipulated in authoritarian countries. And this will be, of course, a fruitful avenue for research going forward. The second issue is that of illiberal consolidation in the region. And again, I think there are a few important points to make before looking at regional trends in illiberalism and authoritarianism. The first is that the regional trends that we've seen in the last 12 months and in the last few years are consistent with this global pattern of democratic deconsolidation around the world. So the so-called democratic recession is now widely understood to be a genuine phenomenon, both in established and in developing democracies. And it's certainly something that we've seen taking place in Southeast Asia. There are some common themes arising from the presentations this year that reflect this pattern of illiberal consolidation. Firstly, government accountability deficits. Take, for example, Risa's discussion of the protests, the student protests in Indonesia last year, which attempted to prevent the passing of revisions to the KPK, to the Corruption Eradication Commission law, and those protests which were seeking to defend an independent Corruption Eradication Commission failed in that objective and were actually repressed fairly effectively by the Jokowi administration. Meanwhile, as Seb described in Malaysia, there has been no democratic accountability around the turnover of government, the collapse of the Pakatan Harapan government at the start of this year, and the rise of Muhyiddin Yassin as a new prime minister. So the question of how elite politicking is potentially disenfranchising populations and reducing government accountability, I think, is a really important one. A second issue relates to the repression of critical expression, opposition, and marginal groups. And of course, this goes hand in hand with the first theme in this sort of discussion of illiberal consolidation. This is an issue that has been long-standing right across Southeast Asia. It's particularly acute in entrenched authoritarian systems such as Laos, and Kieran described some of the ways in which critical expression and opposition continue to be severely repressed in that country. And additionally, we've seen the continuation of lawfare in Myanmar, which is a long-standing means by which the authoritarian government and now the sort of the quasi-hybrid system that exists in Myanmar, these regimes have used the law as a means of repressing marginal groups, repressing opposition groups, and curtailing the scope for dissent. Finally, in Philippines, as Jean mentioned, again, marginal groups have been at the forefront of the continued war on drugs and are increasingly victimized under the Duterte regime, including, of course, women who are frequently subject to this sort of patriarchal discourse arising under Duterte. A final issue, and this is perhaps one that underpins some of the trends towards deepening illiberalism in the region, is polarization, whether it's religious polarization, ethnic polarization, or even intra-regime polarization and fragmentation. So in the case, for instance, of Malaysia, we see under Muhyiddin Yassin the rise of this increasingly chauvinistic politics, or the consolidation of an increasingly chauvinistic politics, which has deeply racist and sectarian overtones. Similarly, in Myanmar, we see this continued polarization between different ethnic groups and between for instance, the government and groups like the Rohingya people who have suffered terribly as a result. Similarly, in Indonesia, the mass protests and mass riots that broke out after last year's elections were indicative of this deep polarization between the supporters of one political faction and the supporters of another. But even if we look at Laos, where Kieran described the polarization within the regime between sort of pro-China and pro-Vietnam factions. So these are sort of phenomena that we see manifested in different ways, but right across the region. So very quickly, if we look at the VDEM Electoral Democracy Index data for the last 10 years, we see that actually the picture does not imply a major shift towards deepening authoritarianism right across the region. It's much more of a mixed picture that we see here. And in addition, although we see a less effective consolidation of liberal democracy in the region, we similarly see this picture where there is a degree of variety. And in fact, many of the countries in the region they sit somewhere fairly similar to where they did 10 years ago. Countries like the Philippines, Indonesia, and even Laos and Cambodia. There's been a degree of sort of stagnation potentially rather than necessarily decline. However, if we look at a more recent picture, if we look at just the last few years, we can see that the general trend, certainly in the last 12 months, has been quite bleak. So this looks at changes in freedom scores according to Freedom House over the last 12 months. And we can see that only 2 countries in the region, only Thailand and Timor-Leste, have actually become more free according to Freedom House's ranking in the last period, so since 2019. Meanwhile, Indonesia, Brunei, Philippines, and Cambodia have all seen a decline in freedom, as indeed has Singapore, a country which for a long time was seen as a very sort of stable and rather stagnant polity. And the picture that this paints of Southeast Asia on the whole at the moment, again, is a very pessimistic one. So the data here from Freedom House indicates only 1 country in the region can be considered free, and that is Timor-Leste. The other countries, including electoral democracies such as Indonesia and the Philippines, are considered only partly free as a result of the curtailment of civil liberties and various other aspects of liberal government. So this, again, is indicative of this sort of illiberal tendency, this illiberal pattern that we've seen sweeping Southeast Asia in recent years. And one of the major indicators of that illiberal trend is the issue of internet freedom. So freedom of online discourse. In online spaces, this is one of the major areas in which we've tended to see the increased opportunities for expression, for free expression. And this is now at the forefront of the contemporary shift towards sort of deepening illiberalism. So if we look at this picture here, we see that Indonesia, the Philippines, and Singapore have all significantly reduced online freedom over the past 12 months. And this is a major reduction across those countries. This is the result of new legislation in Singapore, which has further restricted online speech. Similarly, in Indonesia, we've seen the prosecution of people who post critical comments in social media, people who post sort of pro-opposition discourses in social media. And also in the Philippines, we've seen, as we have across the region, we've seen this emergence of sort of government propagandists on social media. Again, a widespread pattern across the region, the propagandizing of government programs and government achievements, and at the same time, the criminalization of critical discourse. So very quickly, some key takeaways from each of the presentations that sort of reflect this trend over the past 12 months. In the Philippines, we heard from Jean about the war on drugs, about state-sponsored violence against journalists, executive interventions in the judiciary, which is a classic pattern associated with executive aggrandizement, and also the gendered nature of this executive-led illiberalism in Duterte's Philippines. In Myanmar, Susan described this pattern of lawfare, a means by which The law is used as a tool for the repression of dissenting voices and the repression of opposition. A long-standing pattern, of course, in Myanmar, and also one that is reflected right across Southeast Asia. Increasingly, we see similar patterns in the Philippines and in Indonesia and elsewhere. Also, the stagnation of reform. So the significant downgrading over the last few years of prospects for a successful and meaningful democratic transition in Myanmar. This is a common theme that we've seen, I think, at recent Politics in Action fora in relation to Myanmar, this steady downgrading of assessments about the prospects for democratic consolidation. Similarly, ethno-religious polarization and regional conflicts continue to plague Myanmar politics. And of course, these have severe humanitarian consequences, as discussed in relation, for instance, to the Rohingya during Susan's presentation. In Indonesia, as Risa described, we saw unprecedented post-election violence in 2019. We've also seen the crackdown on democratic protests later in the year, and the continued repression throughout this period of government critics. While in Malaysia, we saw the collapse of the Pakatan Harapan government, engineered almost entirely by elites. This opens the space for a sort of an undermining of rule of law reforms, with the stagnation or the lack of resolution of elite corruption cases. And of course, the other big issue here, the politicization of identity, a long-standing problem in Malaysia, and one which may be only exacerbated under Muhyiddin Yassin's administration. In Laos, as Kieran described, long-standing problems that have continued to be sort of visible in the last 12 months. So severe human rights abuses, a lack of press freedom, corruption, and a lack of accountability in government, including, for instance, in its responses to land conflicts and in response to the dam collapse last year. And finally, Vietnam. So Vietnam, I think Huong's presentation on Vietnam was maybe the most optimistic of the presentations this year, the most optimistic analysis of politics. But again, there are a few key issues that I think need to be emphasized. One of those is the way in which the Trung government has centralized power in the hands of the Prime Minister and General Chairman. So this is a pattern that we see in a lot of authoritarian contexts, including in China, another communist government, another communist system. And as in China, it seems that this has been achieved, at least in part, through the purging of potential rivals, potential political rivals, using law enforcement, using corruption cases. Again, a common pattern across Southeast Asia. So we see something fairly similar in places like Indonesia, where corruption cases are increasingly, appear at least to be increasingly politicized, especially since the defanging of the Corruption Eradication Commission last year. And more broadly, right across the region, again, many of these things are shared across boundaries, but malleable or absent rule of law, extreme power imbalances, and the abuse of authority by those in positions of state power, and also the spread of state-sponsored disinformation. So this sort of pattern of propagandizing, particularly in online spaces, is one that continues apace. Very quickly, the final discussion, the final point that I'd make, and this is a brief one, relates to this sort of transnational challenge posed by China's continued expansion in terms of investment, influence, and also its exercise of force, its exercise of power in the South China Sea, for instance. And this, of course, poses some challenges for an organization like ASEAN, which has been viewed as a bulwark of regional cooperation, but is increasingly facing centrifugal pressures as Chinese influence in the domestic politics of Southeast Asian countries increases. There are two ways in which China's influence is, I think, potentially destabilizing or liable to reshape political dynamics across the region. The first, of course, relates to the South China Sea issue, and I would always leave it to our colleagues in international relations to discuss the intricacies of that conflict. But certainly in domestic politics, right across the region, we see the influence of Chinese money, influence of Chinese investment and loans, both to governments and also to incumbent power holders, so political elites within Southeast Asian countries. who are receiving money from China and are potentially then co-opted, to, at least to some extent, by their indebtedness to China. So these are two patterns that I think we'll need to focus on and observe very closely over the coming year, and potentially we'll hear more about at next year's Politics in Action Forum. So very brief conclusions, and we'll start with the international picture before returning to the pandemic. The regional political outlook, I think, continues to be dominated by this issue of Chinese expansion and the way in which Southeast Asian governments and also Southeast Asia's regional architecture responds to that challenge. Domestically, we've seen this pattern of consolidated illiberal tendencies, both in democratic and in authoritarian regimes. And finally, the impact of COVID over the longer term, over the year, months and potentially years to come, remains to be seen. And this will be, again, an issue that we'll need to further reflect upon with the benefit of hindsight, potentially in 2021, when I'm sure SEAC will have another fantastic Politics in Action Forum. So my thanks to everybody for listening, and my thanks also to SEAC, and of course to the 6 country specialists who provided such illuminating presentations this year. Stay safe, everyone, and I hope that we can reconvene in 12 months' time. Cheers.